Hi everyone, you're here with Shannon and Paula with Sage Wellness Connection, and we're back for another year of webcasts and podcasts as part of the Rural Mental Health Project. And last year it was identified through community evaluation that trauma and PTSD and psychological health and safety is an important issue in our community for first responders. So we're going to explore these topics today. Last year, we met with advanced paramedic Jordan Garraway, and we got a really good perspective on the life and the work of a first responder. But today we want to take a closer look at some of these issues that these first responders are faced with and just dig a little deeper and determine what we as a community can then do to support them through some of these challenges that they're facing. So let's get started. Always takes a moment to get through our technical difficulties, but
we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. So we'll introduce ourselves quickly. I'm Paula Iverson. If you've been with us before, you here probably have heard our spiel. Shannon and I have very similar backgrounds. And I guess today, as it pertains to our first responders that we're talking about, we want to expand a little bit of that view as far as what is a first responder. And for myself, I grew up with a mom who was, she started out her career as a nurse and then had a second career as a social worker working in the child welfare field. And so for me, I see that as working on the front lines, as being a first responder, as responding to the needs of the community, as well as trying to reduce the risks. And so those are some of the things that we're going to talk about as we talk a bit more about first responders.
And I'm Shannon Fife, and this is, as Paula was saying, a very personal issue for both of us because we've grown up in it in a variety of ways. My mom also started out as a psych nurse, stayed in working in kind of the recreational field, but always in that hospital setting. So she really did experience lots of the things that we're going to talk about today, just because you're in that setting all the time. But additionally, my dad started out actually as a firefighter and then moved on to the police department and stayed in there for a number of years. So really understanding both perspectives, what it was like for him, and I'm by no means trying to speak, or give him voice, but certainly as the family members in that we experienced something a little bit different than what I learned later in life wasn't what everybody experienced. And then my brother moved on and became a paramedic for a number of years too, really experiencing that front line, a lot of traumatic situations for families, people, and then he was in the middle of that all the time. And now, having his own family and what he has brought home with that has really led us to believe that this is an important issue. It's not just about maybe those traditional people that we see as first responders, but it's certainly even in the traditional sense of what I experienced, I think needs voice. And that's why in this area, we have a number of first responders that sometimes it's not even their primary job, it's a secondary job that they go on to. So we really want to make sure that we're providing the supports as a community, as a friend, and as a family member too, so that they can live that same, healthy, happy life that we talk about that we're all after.
And especially because this is the Rural Mental Health Project, and we always like to thank them for sponsoring this workshop. But I think particularly with this topic, like you said, Shannon, often in rural communities, people as first responders, it's their volunteer position, as many of our firefighters in this area. And so that poses a whole other dimension that they're faced with as well, as far as challenges go.
For sure. And that's why we like to say that if you're looking for resources or there's something about the conversation today that has struck home for you, please look up the Canadian Mental Health Association. We also have some resources on our own website on Sage Wellness Connection. Just reach out, whether it's mental health. Locally, they would also, send you on your way or find you a place that might fit for you if any of this topic is resonating or bringing back, some memories and things that you just feel as though a little support might be of value. And we do like to talk a little bit about our project. You know, Paula had talked at the beginning that after doing a complete year of working within the Rural Mental Health Project and providing webcasts and podcasts, we also did a community evaluation. And a part of that was to find out that there were some other areas that we feel we needed to dive a little bit deeper in. And that speaks to that community-driven piece of the Rural Mental Health Project. We're not just Paula and I out there deciding, hey, this is where we think we should go. We are looking to the community and letting the community send us those messages of saying, hey, here's some more information we might need, or here's some information for you, please pass it along. And that's what the impact committee does. And fortunate for us, because our focus today is first responders, we have Steve Douglas, and he's the fire chief here in Wainwright. And we'll be speaking to him coming up soon, just to dive in deeper as the perspective of being the fire chief. And just even in our brief conversation so far, he has said that they're in desperate need of this localized supports, because there is broader based supports that are Alberta based and things like that. But we've got to build the strength within our community. And that's exactly a piece of the project too, is we want it strength based. We know that we do have some excellent resources already, and we're highlighting some of those on our Rural Mental Health Resource Hub, but there's still more out there. And sometimes they're the unusual suspects, as we like to call them, that are there and they can help out. But additionally, this year, we are working on building a curriculum that will support people to be able to talk about the 8 dimensions of well-being, mental health and well-being, and feel confident but competent too in those conversations, to not be in a clinical sense. We're not going to cure somebody or things like that, but we could definitely send them on to where maybe a certain level of support is available, and they can move in that direction. And that is that whole community perspective. We want everybody to be able to feel as though they're a part of the project, because as we said, everybody is touched somehow, especially when you're in a small community, that you know your neighbor is probably the firefighter. I know that I live beside military police, I live beside RCMP. So they are my neighbors, not just my friends and not just my family. So it is, when you're in these rural locations, you are side by side with these people all of the time. And that's why we really want it collaborative, and why we like to bring people on, you know, our webcasts and podcasts, so that we're giving them voice directly from the people that are experiencing it. And then finally, I just want to say and reiterate it probably a million times for you, is that 5 in 5 people have mental health. We need to remove that stigma of what we've given those 2 words, mental health, to mean, because what it truly means is that we all have mental health. We all experience good things, bad things, stressful things, happy things, all of those kind of things. But as we'll kind of flesh out today, is there's these 8 dimensions that impact that mental health, that make it all up to be one thing. So we just want to make sure that that perspective remains across the project at all times.
And I think that 5 in 5 people having mental health is why we like to take that holistic view, because we're all in this together. We're all dealing with the same thing. We have to be intentional and purposeful about our mental health, just as we do about our physical health. And so we look to the wellness wheel when we're talking with people about mental health and well-being. And we'll just touch on that today before we go into the rest of our webcast. But it is important to know that all areas of your life are interconnected, and they're interdependent on one another. So if one area is out of sync, it can create an imbalance in another area, which impacts your entire system. But because everything is interconnected, you can also use those areas that are of strength to help pull up the other areas or balance out the other areas as well.
Mm-hmm.
So here's our wellness wheel. So our 8 dimensions are emotional, physical, intellectual, social, spiritual, environmental, occupational, and financial. And we have quite a few other webcasts and podcasts that dive deeper into each of these areas. And we also have a personal assessment that we use to help you determine what your areas of strengths are and what areas maybe you need a little extra support in. So if you're looking for that personal assessment, please connect with us through our website, our email, our social media accounts, and we can support you through that assessment.
Absolutely. And I think that's the imperative part to this is this isn't a guessing game. You need some parameters around understanding what is impacting each area to really make a good assessment before you can decide which strengths you have and maybe which areas that needs a little bit of work.
Because this is what our wheel looks like. Many of us have a wheel that is going to look like this, where we're looking at areas that are a little bit depleted, especially in times of stress, in times of trauma, in times of grief. And then there's going to be those areas that we know how to work hard at to keep up. And so the key is to figure out that harmonious way to live and to use those areas to balance each other out.
And you'll probably hear us say many times, as we like to use the analogy of the orchestra, because it is about that work. When you hear an orchestra warm up before they begin, either the concert or whatever it is they're about to do, it sounds like all over the map and squeaking and banging and whatever. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, how can this ever work? And that's a little bit what we kind of feel like when we're talking about all of these dimensions. But when we are able to put that all together, and when they're all done warming up and then they all begin together, then it has this incredible sound that is, you can't even imagine that squeaking and banging could become. But we also like to make the point that it's taken them work. They just didn't show up one day and say, hey, I think I'm going to play a clarinet. And then we do a little warm up and you become this incredible musician. No, they work every day at it. And that's what we're asking as well, that we put the effort in, not to make it sound overwhelming, but just to say we've got to put as much time in as we would for maybe somebody else at work or whatever it is. We are as valued as our work in itself. So just knowing that if we do that and we find the areas of strengths, we can use those as much as when we define those areas that maybe need a little bit more work, then we'll be able to build that up.
For sure. And for the purposes of this webinar, we'll just keep in mind that our wellness wheel is always at the foundation of what we're talking about. And so we may refer back to it, but we're not going to go into each area separately today. So let's get started.
I think it's important, when we did this evaluation with our impact committee, we really needed to define what first responders are. We have that traditional sense, as we alluded to earlier, about, of course, we're going to say firefighters, of course, we're going to say police officers, but it really is broader than that. When you talk about the 911 operators, right? They are experiencing right along with the people that are experiencing the trauma. Disaster emergency response teams. How many times have we heard stories about Red Cross, being in certain areas? In fact, I believe that's happening right now in BC, where they've deployed disaster emergency people and they're helping people out, which is great work, but it is tough work as well.
Oh, yeah, exactly, because they're right in the trenches, so to speak, with people.
Yes, absolutely. And then Paula, you talking about your mom, and actually my mom too, they started out as nurses. Your mom moved on as a social worker. If anyone knows anything around the social work field, it's a tough field. I believe in California, they say that the expectancy in a job is about 6 months before burnout begins, because you are supporting human beings that are in tough and challenging situations. And it's pretty hard at times to separate yourself out from what people are experiencing, especially when you can't just make those absolute changes in their life in that moment. So it's very easy to begin to take on those things if you're not careful.
Well, and in the human services field in general, whether they're social workers or support workers, supporting people when they're in crisis, or people that are marginalized, people that have experienced trauma, they're also first responders, because they are right out with people in the public, in their homes, all of that. So they're seeing all of the challenging things firsthand. Care workers,
Yes.
and I mean, over COVID, we know that for sure. Our healthcare aides, our LPNs working in care homes, working with elderly population, it was a real struggle. Clergy, I imagine the pandemic has highlighted this for us to open our eyes to who is doing some of this frontline work, and teachers as well on that list. I talked to a teacher recently who had said that, not only are they supposed to teach curriculum, get kids prepared to move on to the next grade, now they're expected to be knowing what to do about kids' mental health, and to start to cultivate this strength in kids as well. And that puts a whole nother dimension on teaching.
Absolutely, because we're not talking just academics anymore. We're
No,
talking about being able to identify what's going on with a kiddo all along, being able to teach the ABCs. And I don't want to trivialize it in any way, but because it is a tough job. And
regardless.
you said, the people that we put out on front lines, as we call it in the human service industry, are experiencing what families are experiencing. So it's important to acknowledge and hear their voices along with this too.
And this may not be a comprehensive list. If you feel like you are a first responder, then you are a first responder. And, please feel free to connect with us if you feel like we should add to our list, or just to reach out and let us know how you're doing. And we can always find you support if you need support as well.
And I think the best part about, this webcast today is these concepts can be taken across a variety of areas of life, right? Just because we're looking to define who we're talking about today, these concepts can be used in anything, because many of us have experienced different things in life where maybe we've helped somebody, and they've passed away. That seems pretty extreme, but it also is something that can trigger some of the same things. And that's why you'll probably hear us multiple times today say, hey, if some of this information is bringing up, some emotion for you, please reach out so that we can get you the support that you need.
And I think that goes back to why we use the wellness wheel as well as our opening philosophy and foundation, because this information is transferable to anyone. So that's part of that, the 8 domains.
And I think it's important, though, to always look back, and sometimes we need this level of research and stats in order for people to understand how imperative it is to continue to do the work that we're doing. Because in my mind, if we lose one life each day, that's a crisis. But when we're talking 11 lives lost each day to opioid overdoses, with our first responders, we're not talking about the general population. We're talking about people that specifically fall within this category. That is too much. We are not answering a need. We're not noticing the signs and symptoms. And I don't think it's because we don't want to. I think it's just because we don't necessarily know how to.
Yeah, we're missing something, and I think that's why it was identified that we touch on this topic, because it is a gap, and we need to work towards finding some solutions.
Absolutely. When we're talking 44 approximate percent are showing signs of at least one mental health disorder, that's where we start defining the disorder. It's not a mental health challenge. This is where we're moving along to requiring clinical support in order to move forward in a more positive way in life. And that's staggering, because that's almost half of our first responder workforce that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a big number.
It is like when you actually step back in that and what that really means, that's almost 1 in 2 first responders. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when we say 242 Canadians that have passed by suicide in our military personnel and our public safety, which are those first responders that we would traditionally think about, that number is staggering. So once again, I just think we're not getting the information out. We're not like being able to identify it. And we are going to continue to have to ask people to do this work. But in doing so, we need to be there behind them and giving them the support they need, giving them the time away, whatever it is that they need in order to be able to continue to do the work.
And I think sometimes to do that, we need to get in front of it and be proactive.
Absolutely. Yes. Because if you can begin to identify those things within yourself, that's the key, not waiting on somebody else identifying it for you. And this is a part of the information that translates to anyone, that the more people know and the more your friends or your family know, then they can identify those signs because they know you more intimately than just maybe even your work colleague, that they can maybe see a few things that aren't looking like, hey, that isn't typically Joanne. Why is she acting this way? So we want to make sure people have the skill set to have a little bit more than, hey, she just doesn't normally act this way, but have no idea what the next step would be.
Yeah, for sure. They're going to notice when things start to get out of sync before the person themselves actually notices.
And
so
that's really, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, what does a first responder look like? And I think we have this, I think this is a media perception that first responders are stronger than the rest of us. They're like superheroes. We wouldn't think that a fire and rescue person is going to feel overwhelmed and tired and questioning and feeling heavy and having all of these normal feelings that we all feel from time to time. We set them apart and expect them to be able to handle this. Well, how and why would they be different than any of us?
And I think that's where Jordan had a good point about saying that people like to put a label on it, like a hero. And I'm not minimizing the work you're doing because, you know, we have kind of created that category for running into fires and things like that. But
because it often is heroic. It really is.
It is. And I think that's the difference in the action is heroic, but that doesn't mean you have to carry the label of being a hero, because then we're talking, you know, Marvel comic level of you have to maintain that perception and work all the time. And it's not humanly possible, where they are individuals doing heroic things. Absolutely. And making that distinction, whether it be the social worker that has to walk into the family one more time, just to be able to, for that family to get through the day and give them some pretty hard information. That's heroic work that you continue to do it, but that doesn't mean you have to carry a title that carries as much weight as being overwhelmed.
Well, and I think what happens is that when we set these expectations on these people and they experience challenging situations, crisis situations or traumatic situations, and they experience this trauma, they're not necessarily going to talk about it the way they should talk about it because they are absorbing it, embodying it, with feeling like they shouldn't be experiencing this trauma. But as we know, they are human beings and they are going to have to learn to deal with the trauma and the crisis situations that they are experiencing.
And I know we constantly talk about a little bit of Black humor and things like that, because that's what kind of gets us by at times. Because when you're taking on that or having to walk into those situations, you need some type of relief from it. So it's not always because you're not sensitive enough, but you do and can become very desensitized. And, you know, we used to make jokes, you know, whether it be with my dad or even with my brother, that, you know, with his kids, where he would see, oh, this is a big situation. They pretty much needed to be hanging off a roof and, you know, a 20-foot drop, where maybe the average parent would run out on the 1-foot drop, worrying about what the circumstance might end up to be, just because you can, when you see so much so worse, all of a sudden it just trivializes everything else. And I'm not saying that's the same for everybody, but it's certainly something that can happen. And you even do it in your own life as the first responder as well. Like, I also give the story of my brother being in a very serious accident where his ability to live through it, we don't even know why, because where he was sitting in the vehicle no longer existed. And yet he got out of the vehicle and secured the scene like any paramedic would do when they normally arrive. But yet he was actually should be the one receiving the services. And he walked out of that thinking he was perfectly fine because he was just in that mode of doing his job. And now he's carried some of those effects of that accident. And that's the desensitization that you don't always see.
Well, and sometimes I think that even though maybe mentally or cognitively they are becoming desensitized and they're not letting it phase them maybe the way it would you or I, but their body is still absorbing it, and at a embodied level, they're still experiencing these crisis situations, which become trauma. And let's just take a look at what trauma is. So trauma is the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. So a distressing event might be different for different people, but a distressing event doesn't necessarily have to be something so huge.
No.
I think that sometimes it is a little bit of a miss, because trauma is trauma for each individual person, no matter what size the event is. It's whatever. And I think sometimes because we carry scars from our past, from situations that happened from our past, sometimes a small thing can actually resurrect that old trauma and cause new trauma as well. So we have to look at, I guess this is another place where we look at the holistic picture. We're not just looking at first responders across the board. It's each individual person and what they're experiencing. And often it leads to feeling shame, especially if you're like your brother, someone who is seen as a very strong person and has experienced many distressing crisis situation. If something is starting to nag at them and bother them, they're going to start to feel shame that they can't handle this anymore. It's that feeling of helplessness, powerlessness, and then it turns into fear.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's going back to that hero title. That's a weight to carry, because heroes don't feel pain. They can keep powering through. And when we give those kind of titles, you can't just normalize something that, hey, I just feel very sad about that situation and it is impacting me. And maybe it wasn't as big as the last situation, but it doesn't really matter. But we have to be careful we don't trivialize things like that, because we don't know from person to person or event to event, even for that one person, what can actually create what we would define as a trauma.
Exactly. And I think we tend to do this as well as human beings in general. We trivialize, or we label people as, oh, she's sensitive. Of course, she's going to cry when she sees the bird get hit by a car or the dog get, whatever. We label people that she's sensitive. It's okay if she feels that way. They've lived a challenging life. Of course, they're going to experience that, but we leave our first responders still on the outside of all of that. And I think we need to challenge those viewpoints for sure.
And then you kind of said this earlier, that when we talk about scars from our past, that can be those childhood trauma pieces where we experience things early in life. And it can be a little bit of anything, right? There's things, of course, like abuse and neglect. But when we talk about disrupted attachment, where, either a parent dies or they have to go away. We look at the military families where one spouse is going away or one parent is going away for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. At the end of that, it does create some attachment. I don't want to label it as issues. It just becomes distressing because you don't know. There's so much uncertainty when that parent is gone as to whether they can come back or not. So those are some of the pieces that is not going to be washed across every child to feel the same way, but it's certainly something that could create, move towards trauma for a child, and we have to acknowledge it, not because the sensitive child where we expect them to, but the one that just seems like they're walking through life, that they're not experiencing it, they just may well be as well.
Well, and I think as an adult, we don't always have conscious memory of what's caused us trauma or what's caused us distress. And I think that's where it becomes problematic, because those embodied memories, that's what comes up when we experience a distressing situation as an adult, is some of those things that happen before we have conscious memory, or we could experience it even at 10 years old, but my memory is not reliable from when I was 10 years old. And so sometimes I think that it might be helpful for people that are in these types of careers that they're getting counseling as they are working, because they need to work through some of these old scars, if we're going to use that word. So they're ready, they're on top of things, so when they're coming across these other distressing situations, they have a handle on their past.
Well, and I think you kind of brought up an interesting point as well. Like when you're a child, what happened and how you perceived it is how you take on the trauma around it, even though that might not be factual. And I think as adults supporting children, we want to wash it over with, well, that wasn't actually what happened, but it actually doesn't matter. And honestly, our adult memories aren't really that reliable
No,
either.
they're not. No, they're not. But you know, what's interesting, you're talking about those memories. Sometimes I think we take for granted too that maybe it didn't happen to me, but maybe it happened to someone around you. Have you ever had a memory, and this happens with siblings, because I know it's happened with my sister and I, will both have the same memory and think it happened to, we each think it happened to ourselves.
Yes.
Like, how does that happen? Memories just are not always reliable. And sometimes I think with traumatic memories, things are blown up out of proportion as well, because our memory is part of the feeling behind what happened.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
this could be a whole other webcast in itself, but I think this just goes, it really goes to show how deep trauma affects us.
Yes. And I think because we're talking about the central nervous system, right? And those physiological responses as well. And kind of what can happen, and believe me, this is a very layman approach, and I'm sure any clinical person would want it to be far more in depth, but just to give just a very basic sense of what is happening is when we've experienced trauma and we've taken that on, what can happen is we get caught in the loop of that trauma, but without necessarily all of the factual details. So then we can have people on the outside trying to fix our memory, saying, well, no, actually that either didn't happen to you, that was your sibling, or that was miles away, you couldn't have felt that. But that's why we are learning now that trauma can be experienced in utero. So you're not witnessing necessarily anything. You have no visual memory of it. You have potentially no necessarily auditory memory of it. It's something actually more that the mom is experiencing, and you're getting scars from it. So
they talk about the scars on the brain of maternal stress can be similar to what prenatal alcohol exposure.
Yes.
Those type, the scars that are left on the brain from that can be similar from the scars of maternal trauma. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, totally. And we just wanted to define a little bit that there can be childhood trauma, but then there can be adult trauma where you've experienced something in your adulthood, like a serious accident or victims of violence, even natural disasters. Many of us have been watching the news and watched it across the last few years, even through the pandemic, even internalizing some of that information, or just actual natural disasters where we have fires, people are displaced, wars, all of those kind of things. So never to trivialize how that impacts a person, and then really understanding yourself of how much of that information as an adult you can actually take on. And creating
Yeah.
those boundaries again of maybe it's just not something you can listen to every day. That doesn't mean you don't care about it. It just means you're protecting your own mental health. That if you want to be that supportive person down the road, you probably can't take in all the details all the time about it, and that's okay too.
Well, and I often hear working with the clients that I've worked with in the human services field, they'll say things like, I'm 30 years old or I'm 40 years old. Why can't I get past this? Why is this still ruling my life? And I think that takes us into our next slide, is that sometimes trauma that cannot be resolved, or there's just things that are that won't go away. It's actually created post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes, and that is a different level of traumatic stress, and that's we wanted to really make that distinction. This is acknowledged as well in the DSM-I, so we want to make sure that people understand kind of the difference. Just because you've experienced trauma and even taken on some of the effects of experiencing that trauma doesn't mean you will necessarily have post-traumatic stress disorder, but another person that could have been in the exact same situation could. So that's the uniqueness part of it, and where we never want to downplay it, because maybe for yourself or someone you know didn't end up to be PTSD, but for their whether it be a partner, friend, family, work mate was in that same situation, it could be for them. So never to minimize who can land there, but to do know that this has to be like going through a series of testing with a clinician before it's ever diagnosed.
But even if it's not diagnosed and you think that you have something that's happened to you and it's just something that you cannot get over, something that's disrupting your life, your ability to manage your emotions, maintain relationships, you need to get support. As we always say, there is no harm in finding that counselor, finding a therapist, talking to a doctor, a professional. You need, if you feel that you can't get past something, seek out support, because we don't want something that is trauma that can be worked through to become post-traumatic stress disorder. There's levels of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So simple PTSD or complex PTSD.
And quite often with our first responders, right, we see that it can become that more complex PTSD, or military people that are in a war zone, or just even in what is supposed to be a supportive military action, can become more complex because it's reoccurring traumas that are happening daily over and over.
It's like layers, layers on top of layers.
Yes, and that's where, can really have that impact on relationships, trusting relationships, but even forming something that is healthy. Because when I said earlier about how the brain is impacted in that central nervous system, and you're getting trapped in that fight, flight, freeze, and now we know befriend is the new level where you almost become that people-pleasing space, and you can't move away from it. We're not talking about just the, hey, I really like to do nice things for people. This is where it's becoming a cyclical problem over and over again.
Well, I was, as you were talking, Shannon, and we're talking about the layers, I'm thinking of those of you who have heard Shannon and I, you know that we're not very good at analogies, or but what is it, the straw that broke the camel's back? That's what it made me think of. That's what happens. It's those layers of trauma, and they pile up, and then it could get to that point where it's that straw, that one small thing, that all those layers start to tumble down, because you just can't carry anymore. The load is simply too heavy.
And so, isn't it, that's kind of what cycles back to that when we talk about feeling shame or something for getting help, is because sometimes it can be just this small issue and you're like, are you kidding me? I've experienced bigger things than this. Why is this impacting me so much? I should be stronger than this, because it is a multi-layered thing.
Yes, it is. And I think it's important. We'll move on to the next slide. It's important to recognize some of the signs and symptoms as well, because of the layers, and we're not recognizing them, and they're building up and building up.
And I think my example of my brother being that first responder, advanced paramedic, that's in his own accident. He's
Yeah.
been in multiple accidents, right? Supporting people that, people that have passed away, very tragic, terrible accidents where he couldn't necessarily see the terrible, tragic accident that was in front of him. He was just securing it, making sure everybody was okay, and nobody did, pass away in that. That's sometimes those things that it is one about layers of, you've been through it many times, but now you've experienced something on your own. You don't recognize it at first, but then other people are going to pay like a price in you not recognizing that. So we never want you to minimize, even if it was a simple car accident, if you're experiencing some feelings about that, that's okay. That doesn't make something wrong with you, or you're too weak or something to get through a fender bender or whatever you want to categorize it as. Everybody experiences it differently.
Yeah, well, and I think about it, I've heard many stories over the years working with people that are at risk, or people that are having some struggles in their lives, some very heavy situations. And then again, it's piled up, and I, hear heavy situations such as a child being taken away or a domestic abuse situation. And then a client tells me that their cat died and they're broken up about it. But then that's the straw. It's a small event. And you're questioning yourself, why am I broken up over this cat? Well, no, it's broken up by all of those other situations that maybe I felt powerless to handle. We've talked about that. There was that helplessness, the powerlessness that also comes into play when we're dealing with that pyramid of events that happens. And I think part of dealing with for first responders is also learning to be kind and gentle to yourself, and knowing that you have all these experiences and all those layers as well.
And I think the interesting point we talk about here, we're talking perspective of the first responder, but then it's being the person on the outside of that, where you could easily make a judgment, be slightly biased on it. Are you kidding me? It was your cat. You had your children taken away, but you're reacting more to the cat.
It's true.
As opposed to saying, oh my goodness, you've had all of these situations, like you were saying, Paula, and now this was just one more thing that just finally made you feel so powerless. It wasn't that you didn't feel bad about your children being taken away. And I think we can, as helpers on the other side of that, have to check ourselves as well, that we acknowledge that this is usually that pile up, not just the one situation, and not making that judgment on someone.
Or reminding ourselves that everyone is unique, because the cat in and of itself, a pet dying is traumatic.
Absolutely.
Because pets are an important part of our life. I'm not trivializing a cat dying, but we need to remind ourselves as well that cat dying could trigger a trauma memory from something in our childhood that we're not even connecting to. Maybe we were at a funeral of a distant relative, but we were too young to process it, and everyone was crying and it was very heavy. And maybe that cat dying, maybe something in that situation triggered that past event that we don't even have in a conscious memory. It is a subconscious event, but we don't know. And I think that's where we need to, like you said, we need to check ourselves as well when we are on the outside of the situation.
Yeah, outside, inside, whether it's about us, checking those biases, that societal norms have created, checking the judgments on that we can even place on yourself. And like you said, maybe being a little bit kinder, that it doesn't matter what kind of broke the back of the camel. It's just a matter that you acknowledge it and find some support around that.
Yeah, for sure. I thought you were going to have create a rhyme, outside, inside. I was waiting for something.
I know. If I was better about it,
Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
So anyways, it's a heavy topic. It's always good. Shannon and I always, we know each other well, so we know when we can and can't have that humorous piece to what we're talking about. So let's move on to talking a little bit about stress, because I think the bottom line for many of these first responders careers is that there is a lot of stress. Sometimes the stress is good though.
Yes.
And I think sometimes it's needed. Sometimes when I'm in my job and I have a lot of paperwork to finish because it's that time of the month that I need to get that paperwork done, I need that good stress to push me along because I can procrastinate the paperwork. So there is that good stress that helps us get things done, or it helps us to do what needs to be done, such as if a nurse is working in an emergency room and it's really busy, they need that little bit of stress to help them get through that shift. I think it's just important to know that it's that either the low stress or the high stress, or we call it like good stress or toxic stress when it switches.
Absolutely. And, and I think in even that conversation that we had with George, it was about finding that optimal stress, that you need that little bit of an adrenaline boost when you're going in. You don't want to go in flat and be like, hey, buddy, what's going on? You look fine to me.
I'll be there after I have my coffee.
Yeah, yes. You need that level to be there, to be able to respond. It kind of opens up our other senses as well. We're a little bit, we can hear, we can feel, we can see things a little bit clearer because adrenaline does that for us. And that's what we need. But it's just understanding that we can't stay there all the time. And that there is going to be a little bit of that other side to it. Like you said, even in the paperwork side, when we know we're on a deadline, that gets sometimes the work done that we needed to get done. But we know that there might be a little bit of a downside after. So just preparing for that's okay. We got the work we needed. Let's make sure that we've also allocated enough for a break so that when we need to do all these other tasks, we're available to do that as well.
So what can we do to help us get through the stressful times, help us deal with trauma, and to be able to cope? So I think, as most of what we talk about is, let's start at the beginning and build that awareness of what is, even just talking about stress, because I think we minimize stress so much nowadays because there are so many heavy things going on around us. So it is building awareness of yourself, knowing what good stress is for you, knowing that optimum level, and then knowing what happens after it gets too much. How do you manage it? Knowing myself, I may handle stress differently than Shannon. What is becoming too much for me? And then even knowing maybe what are the consequences of that. Knowing, like I said, getting ahead of things, knowing what how to work on some of our past traumas as well is very important to kind of for a starting point.
And when we talked about this project and when we went back and we were doing those evaluation pieces, we really felt after we completed that, our next step really was about this building awareness, but doing that through creating a curriculum where people could feel confident and competent about talking about all of the different aspects of mental health and well-being, and that includes those 8 domains. So that training will become available in the fall, that anyone will be able to take it online, or we'll be doing some in-person training as well. If that's more your way of doing things, you really want that immediate interaction, we're going to have that available too, because we feel like that's how we can get out to communities. The more people that we build up and can understand that information, they're going to take it back, like we said earlier today, to their areas of specialty or their family and friends, wherever that might be. And then we create those ripple effects so more people know, more people identify it, but it also can reduce some stigma because we don't have those judgment and bias because we know some more information around it.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think this is part of also developing a more resilient team. Team doesn't have to be necessarily your work team. It can be whatever. If you are interested in taking this training and you want to take it back to your community and work in a workplace, work in whatever volunteer organization you're in. Taking that back is going to build that resiliency.
And we, once again, you're always going to hear that word about self-care. There's strategies that are working for you, and we really want to press this issue about self-kindness as well, because you have to do that step first. You have to be willing to be kind to yourself in order to do the strategies that come with self-care.
Yeah, because without the self-kindness piece, the self-care almost seems futile.
Yes.
Right? You still have those, okay, I'm going to take a couple hours and go to the gym, but I'm going to work really hard and, beat the stress out of myself. But sometimes when you're still having that negative self-talk where you might be on the treadmill and you're saying, get over it, pick yourself up. What the heck are you still doing, wallowing about this situation? Get over it. That self-kindness piece, it's still chipping away at the self-esteem. It's still allowing those traumatic events to kind of fester in the background, because you're almost allowing your self-confidence, your self-esteem to be at a lower level than if you're talking more positive and kind things to yourself.
And I think that's the good point about when we were saying how the mental health here has allowed those open sessions twice a week from 1 to 3, is saying you don't have to know. You don't have to know if this is some mental health crisis or even mental health support is what you need. But that's taking that first step to be able to make it okay that this might be something that you just can't answer yourself. I'm pretty confident when people break their arm, they don't think twice whether they should go to the hospital and get a doctor to look at it. They don't, right? They don't go out, hopefully anyways, to the back alley and say, I can figure out how to unbreak my arm. They're going to look for a professional. So why can't we accept the same level of health or same level of support when we talk about our mental health?
Exactly. And I think that's part of the reducing the workplace stigma, because if you need to take time off work to access mental health, it should be accepted. It shouldn't be stigmatized. I think we did talk about that maybe in a past webinar, but our addictions and mental health office here in Wainwright, which covers the MD, now has 2 hours twice a week for walk-in appointments. And like Shannon said, you don't have to know why you don't have to have it pinpointed why you're going. You just need to know that you would like some extra support and show up, and qualified therapists will be able to support you in doing that assessment to help you determine what your focus needs to be in those sessions. Also taking a look at what is available in your workplace. Many workplaces have employee family assistance programs, and there's many times they offer online counseling as well. And I believe that many of those EFAP programs now offer a few sessions for free to get started. And I think that's what it's there for. It's to access that support. And those sessions are confidential, so it should be available to you without having to face that stigma if that's still something that's a challenge.
And then we talk about kind of those sustainable support pieces. When we talk about ripples and the more people know, then they can help their people. That's what we mean around peer support groups. We've met people in the last year who had started some of their own support groups. I believe there was one around infertility and just the challenges and struggles from emotions to money to all of that come with it. And this young lady had created her own peer support group so that people had a place to talk about it. Not just strategize about what you can do, just sometimes talk about how hard it can be emotionally and beyond the finances, and have somebody who can understand because they've been through it as well. And that's what brings the magic of a peer support group. And Paul and I have had the chance to do that with families that are raising kids with complex needs. And we've seen across 10 years how that can impact families in a positive way, make them feel a little bit more supported, know that there's other people feeling the same things as them. but also creating some relationships on the outside of that as well as a long-term ripple, as you might say.
Mhm. So being informed of trauma, depression, addiction, and suicide, accessing information like what we're putting out today, accessing people. We at the end will talk a little bit about our mental health and well-being resource hub. So finding the people in your community that are there to support you. But being trauma informed is a little different as well. It's a little bit more about how do we go about things when we're going through our lives every day and we're talking to people, and especially if you're in the first responders field, it's really being aware of what you're all going through together, or being aware of what someone else is going through. If it is a new young nurse that has just been hired and they're dealing with a situation that maybe many other nurses have seen 100 times, still being aware that it's that particular nurse's first time, and she needs to be treated a little bit differently than maybe the nurse that's seeing this for the 120th time, is that she needs to have some debriefing. Maybe she needs to be referred on, or she just needs to know that it's okay to feel however she's feeling, and to have a little bit of, I guess, being treated with some compassion and respect. And I think it's important that there is someone in the organization that can be that change agent, be that champion, to ensure that these things are not being overlooked, to make sure that they have the number for the Employee Family Assistance Program, that they know who in the community that the coworker can be referred to when needed.
Absolutely. And I think it's like you said with your example with the nurses, sometimes bringing in somebody new in that situation that hasn't experienced those things reminds us of what it felt like. And
Yeah.
right, because we talked about being desensitized, but we're still being impacted, even though we may feel desensitized from the situation.
Yes.
And that can remind us why maybe we need the help just as much. And if we can find somebody who's willing to embrace that and bring it to organizations, or like we keep saying, family and friends as well, that can make the difference. Reduces shame, reduces stigma, reduces all of those barriers that might be there for somebody to just get the support that they need.
Exactly. And I think we missed our increasing overall mental health and well-being, because I think sometimes we skip over this because this is part of what we do. And
Yes.
we're very purposeful and intentional with some of the things that we're doing. But it really is, it's looking to those 8 domains, if you want to go back to those, because that is that foundation. What are you doing in the area of your physical wellness to make sure that you are keeping at an optimal level? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating healthy? Are you getting outside? Are you getting some exercise? Those types of things. Are you, is your financial wellness, is it in the background? Is it one of those things that's sitting on your shoulders? Do you need to take care of some of your financial wellness? Do you need to support yourself with your spiritual wellness? Is that something that's been lacking? So looking to that wheel to really determine what are your needs, and also really congratulating yourself on the areas that you are working on, because sometimes that really knowing your successes and knowing your strength also helps boost us up a little bit as well.
Absolutely can be that motivating factor. And that's, if you have the chance to listen to our 8 domains of wellness, that, goes into a little bit more detail about each one of those aspects, how they're interconnected. But we also talk lots about that engine light being on, really just paying attention to that and saying, okay,
Yeah.
It's there. I can keep trying to ignore it, but eventually my tires are not going to let me move forward. So let's find out what we can do around that.
Yes, exactly. And knowing what your triggers are and your cues are when you are becoming depleted.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to our psychological health and safety. and talk a little bit more about this.
And we just wanted to dive just a little bit into, this is more specifically around that workplace aspect of mental health and well-being, because we talk about psychosocial factors, all of those kind of things that impact our workplace. And it's quite similar to, talking about the 8 domains. Each one of those are going to impact the workplace, but how we treat people, to how the workplace is set up, the environment that is created, the openness when we talk about, well, your workplace maybe should support you on getting mental health and well-being supports during the day, if that's what works for you. It's really looking to all of those different factors, right down to the physical factors. What are the lights like above you? What kind of chair do you sit in? How many times can you get up? Is that meant and set up for the optimal workspace for you? Because maybe your neighbor likes to sit longer than you, or maybe your neighbor likes to get up and down many times. So we have to watch our own judgment and bias in other people, and just create an environment that we can have great conversations about what that needs to look like for you to be successful at work, and right down to timelines. And I think that as we move forward, the pandemic kind of opens some doors that way, that maybe the workday can look a little bit different. Maybe lots of places don't have to be that traditional 8 to 5 kind of a look. It can, and have 2 breaks and a lunch. Then maybe you can have breaks throughout the day, because you're not a person that requires lots of time at lunch, but maybe you like to work a little bit later, or maybe you like to work a little bit earlier. All of those pieces, and do a really good assessment so you can get the most and optimal pieces out of your employees. And that's the ultimate of the psychological health and safety when we're looking at those kind of programs.
We spend a lot of time at work during our lives, and so the issue of psychological health and safety in the workplace is a major issue. And there's a national standard when it comes to psychological health and safety. Sometimes it takes a champion in the workplace to really ensure that this standard is being followed. This is the psychological health and safety is like the other side to occupational health and safety. We put there's so much time and effort that's often put into those physical barriers to our work, but we forget that there are also psychological barriers, there's psychological issues that impact us during our workday until it's too late. And so we need to get proactive. We need to have champions in the organization, or have the organization itself champion this psychological health and safety.
And we do dive a little bit deeper in some of those stats and costs, because sometimes that is the motivating factor for workplaces and organizations and corporations to make those changes, because they're staggering. The hundreds and thousands of dollars that are lost every year on disability claims, long-term disability due to mental health challenges within the workplace, it's staggering. But if you want to learn a little bit more, we do a workplace wellness 101 that gives you some of those parameters of what can happen in organizations, or what is happening within organizations. And that just might be the motivating factor that you'll want to be that change agent for your place.
Absolutely. If you are looking for more information around the psychological health and safety in the workplace, please connect with us. We have done a project in the past that took a deep dive into this topic, and so we'll definitely be able to support you through this.
And I think it's near and dear to our hearts, because we do have some specific training around the PH&S, as we call it, where we can go in and make assessments on the workplace and give you some strategies in order to move forward in a more positive way for your employees. So that's why we want to bring it up. And then when we wash it into that first responder realm, it becomes vitally important in order to maintain our first responders to be able to do the great work that they are doing.
Because I think we've talked a lot about this, Shannon and I, in over the years, but we've heard some conversations over the pandemic about organizations are trying to identify the work and the psychological health of their employees, They're trying to support them. They're trying to acknowledge them. But sometimes what happens is that the acknowledgement alone is not enough. It is about the engagement.
Yes.
It's about the support all along. There was someone who talked to us about an employer, and we could see that the employer was trying to acknowledge the employees and trying to support them, but it was giving something trivial, a small token. Let's say it was like a gift certificate, a small gift certificate for coffee or something. And it almost felt like the work was being trivialized because they were handed this token, is how they saw it at the time, because it's deeper than just being acknowledged with a gift. It goes deeper than that. It has to be true engagement to find out what is really going on with the workers, with the staff. What do they need to really support them? And then how can this be carried out every day?
And I think that was kind of our motivation behind creating that mental health and well-being, like it's a workplace assessment for each individual, no different than you would do a hazard assessment.
Yeah.
You would look to each individual, follow our format, and then you would be able to make those comparisons to other employees of how you can make this work within your workplace, but it's individualized enough so you're truly hearing their voice of what they need. Because like you said, Paula, not everybody needs that gift certificate. It's not answering the need for their mental health, but maybe extra 15 minutes of going for a walk during the day is for that person. So
or just giving them extra time off and supporting them to go and see a counselor during the day, because that's really what they need.
Yes, because they don't have any family commitments, right? Maybe in the evening. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I get where it's coming from. Those kind of gifts, those kind of, we're going to bring someone in and do a quick self-care talk or a yoga class or something. Those are coming from a good, well-intentioned place. But like you said, the assessment needs to be done on the staff themselves. Almost think of it as like this assessment. It's almost like an individualized focus group to be able to see what are my employees in my workplace actually needing for to support their well-being.
And it gives you concrete information, right?
Exactly.
And you have the numbers to support that. So many people would prefer, that 15 minutes or be able to do that counseling during the day. So you have maybe 50% that require that, 50% don't. So how do we make those accommodations that work for everyone? It's really no different than your OH&S, where you're going to have that safety person come in and say, hey, that chair does not work for that employee. It's going to create a long-term disability claim for them. So let's just change up the chair. Something pretty simple when we think about what that cost could be down the road. That's all we're saying. Do that same assessment at that psychological or psychosocial level for people, and you'll have the same gains and less cost down the road.
Oh, for sure. Because what works for me, and you and I are, like we've talked about, our backgrounds are very similar. The work we do is very similar, but what is going to work for you is not going to work for me, because we still are individual people with individual needs. For example, I might be good to come into work from 8 till 4, but Shannon stays up later. That's just her routine. That's just who she is as a person. And 8 to 4 is not going to work for her all of the time. No. And so to have a bit of that flex schedule, if that's the type of workplace that you're in that allows for that offer of a flexible schedule is huge. Absolutely. We're both working the same amount of hours. We're both accomplishing the same work, but that option to be able to pick one or the other is invaluable. So it doesn't have to be things that are going to necessarily cost the employer money.
No, and we're never talking about reducing your output, because you never have buy-in from whether it's any corporation or organization.
And that's not sustainable. Like you said before, sustainability is key.
But what we need to do when we're considering the first responder lens to this is we need to not be in a crisis that they don't have enough doctors or nurses or first responders or social workers or teachers that can come into work because of their mental health challenges being in the way of that. So how do we create this world where we can combine the two together, and not be in a crisis level of support? Because we know that this is translating into some pretty dangerous situations if we don't have enough of those people to be able to do that job around, or unwilling to do it because of the cost, on their person themselves.
But if you are interested in being that workplace champion, please connect with us. What is a workplace wellness champion? So this is where strong leadership is key. Someone who has the desire to support either their colleagues or employees with their health and well-being, to be able to be at their optimum level at the workplace and then go home and still be at an optimum level.
And it really is going to create some stronger relationships, and the resiliency is the key, right? We want to build resilient workforces, workplaces, all of those kind of things. And being that champion is just saying, we're not expecting you to take on the whole task yourself. Just bring the information, because information and education is key to all of this, to build, like we keep talking about, those ripples of change down the road.
Well, and I think at that wellness champion, it's always important to know that there's someone that you can go to, someone who's going to provide a safe place, someone who's going to respect what you have to say, and someone who's simply going to listen. And they do not have to have all the answers, but they have some tools to be able to then guide you to the next step.
And, if we even talk a little bit, in our background as far as what we're doing, whether it being in a counseling context, coaching context, any of those things, when somebody's coming in, they're not coming in for you to tell them what they need to do different.
People don't want that.
No, they don't. They really just need the time and space to work through things that are impacting them, to be able to see it. Because we talked about perception, right? And perception becomes the reality. So let's just let that person have the time and space to be able to work through those things, and they will find the answers if we give them the forum to do that.
Yes, it is. It's that time and space. People want to be heard. They don't want to just come in and say, I have this issue or concern, and then all of a sudden you're rattling off, okay, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, go.
Yeah.
That's not how
here's your sheet, off you go. No, most people are never going to get to A. So
no,
that's all we're suggesting, right? But first and foremost, like Paula said, if you're interested in this, please reach out to us. We'd really like to see this as a project piece as we move forward.
Absolutely.
But I think we've covered lots today.
Yes, for
we
sure.
always like to kind of categorize it into our 4 main areas of exploring, discovering, connecting, and then of course reflecting. And when we look at all of this information that we've talked about today, we must begin by exploring what are the mental health challenges, and those impacts of trauma, PTSD, all of those things on our first responders, but also on our families and the workplace too.
Yeah, because if the families don't have the tools or don't have the understanding, and that safe, or that first responder doesn't have that safe space to land at the end of the day, that's really tough as well. And then creating a personal resilience toolkit. And so that is, it doesn't have to be a huge technical type of a thing. It's just knowing a few places to go when you need support, knowing that the organization has an EFAP program, knowing just the small things that we talked about today, knowing that the mental health office has 2 days a week where you can walk in, or having some background knowledge about your stress or your well-being, such as like having some knowledge about the 8 domains of wellness.
Absolutely. And when we talk about a toolkit, it's a bit like a toy box. when kids are small, we don't think twice about, you put some things away, even though they played with them. But if they have everything around them, they become overwhelmed. So we take some of those toys away for a while, we put them in the toy box, and then we bring them out later. That's what the toolkit is about too. You're not going to use everything in the toolkit all the time, but it's certainly nice to be able to reach in the bag and find something that you knew about, haven't used in a while, and all of a sudden it's there and thinking, yeah, actually this might work for me right now. So that's just building that up with those resources like Paula was talking about.
It's just having a bit of security to know that if I need to access that toolkit or access that information, that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we've been talking a lot about lately is peer support groups, because we strongly believe in peer support groups. We've run one for close to 10 years ourselves in our human services field, and we've seen how well it works. We've seen the connections that our caregivers have made. We've seen the information that they've been able to pass to each other. And what I think I really love about peer support groups is that you're going to find the true understanding from the other participants in that group, because only those who have walked in your shoes can truly understand. And I think that finding that peer support group is a huge thing. This is something that we are going to be doing some work on in the future. So please stay tuned about our peer support groups, because they are coming.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, of course, we've talked already about an organization having mental health programs that have inclusivity, along with, creating that really healthy, respectful workplace. And that can only be done by doing the work, in the background about understanding what does that mean in the workplace. And it can be unique to each workplace. So there's no one size fits all here, but it is, some great work to be done, that you'll build that really resilient workplace and workers for you if you do that work.
And are discovering. So building your creativity, connecting with people, being curious about things, and the lifelong learning. I just think of all of the amazing things that we've learned over the past year as we've connected with our community members and done these webcasts and podcasts. We don't exist in a bubble. We have the ability to access our community members around us. We really believe in that, that it takes a village to get by. We need to be able to rely on each other and learn from each other and access what we have available to us as well.
Oh, absolutely. And when we talk about engaging and what you're doing, no matter what it is, that's really being present in the work and being present in making a choice that we can make these mentally healthy workplaces, that we can be more mentally resilient as well. But it does come with, using some of our curiosity, as we said, even being creative. But the connection piece is, once again, looking towards the people we need to connect with. And sometimes that's our peers as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And keeping your brain active, of course, we are big believers in that. And the questioning piece, I really think that just because we question ourselves doesn't mean we're doing it wrong. It's just questioning it. I mean, I think of all of the time, Shannon, where we're doing something and then we realize, oh my goodness, we could have done it this way and we could have saved, so much time by doing it this way. So so it is questioning, is this the best way that I can do things? What can I do to make this better for myself? So questioning is just something that I think is really important and often overlooked.
And that comes along with challenging yourself, right?
Yeah.
Challenging your thoughts, challenging your beliefs about something. And then, of course, we've said lots today already about connecting with outside supports, being open to that, not putting any judgment or bias around that, because as soon as we release that from ourselves, we're also releasing it for others. So if it makes it easier to look at it that way, so that you allow yourself that level of self-kindness, please do it, because it will make a difference for your colleague or your family or your friend as well.
And the connect piece, we've talked about most of these things already, so just continue to learn. We've talked about the engagement. I like this. There isn't always a right answer, but sometimes there is multiple. I think that we do get caught up in that one lane, and sometimes there's many lanes, many ways to do things, and I think that we need to be open-minded to find that. Be open-minded to new ideas, insights,
And that's
thoughts, values.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
I was just going to say, and that's by exposing yourself to different things, right?
Yeah.
Bringing in
Yes.
other people's viewpoints allows that exposure from, hearing a different way of life, a different way of managing something that can just set off that light bulb faster than staying in your own scope. And that just always leads us back to sometimes joining other groups like peer support groups, work groups, whatever it is, just brings that validation around that for us.
Yeah, because as we get to know people and see their values and see their point of views, it opens up a whole new world for ourselves, because we don't need to stay stuck in one area.
Absolutely. And finally, we talk lots about, I don't think you can move forward if you don't take the time to reflect on what you've already done. There's no point in not acknowledging what has been done, because that's what teaches us the lessons of what we can do a little bit better as we move forward. And it doesn't matter what realm that's in. We can look at the things that are working for us, working for our workplace, working for our families, whatever it might be, but it is absolutely okay to let go of the things that no longer serve us.
And when we run our support group, we often ask, what challenges are you experiencing? And then we really encourage our caregivers to explore what is going well, because often our challenges just outweigh, or they're just so much heavier, like we talked about, right? All the layers and whatever I said about the weight on your shoulders, it just always feels so great and so big and so heavy. It's really important to explore what is going well and being very purposeful about that as well, because it shines a new light on what's going on for you.
And this reflection really does give us the opportunity to consider the supports that work for us, and maybe that might work for somebody else, but being open-minded to somebody else's thoughts around that too.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece of connecting with others, connecting with the community members. It's building that capacity. And we have started last year, as part of the Rural Mental Health Project, our mental health and well-being resource hub. It is a work in progress. It is not meant to be finished, because there's always new people doing new things and new supports that come available. And so we like to collect our formal and informal supports. So as we've said throughout the entire webcast, if you have information and would like to connect with us, please do so as well. In terms of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Resource Hub, we'd like to hear if there's a support that you offer, or a support that you know of that is offered in our community and surrounding areas that should be added to the hub. We would love to add that.
Absolutely. And please just take a look anytime. Maybe that support, you haven't found exactly the right one for you, but something may resonate, and maybe they're the ones that are able to direct you on to something that will work for you.
So thank you so much for being with us today. We hope to hear from you. And if not, we hope to have you view one of our other podcasts or webcasts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.